means that over the next 30 to 35 years, the urban population is growing by 170,000 people on a daily basis, either because babies are born or because people are moving into cities. Now, in an ideal world, if you tell me what, because one thing is what would I envisage or what would I think is the most efficient city in 2050, another thing is what will happen. And of course, what will happen will depend very much on the geography we're talking about, because the dynamics in Africa and Asia with a very young population are very different from the dynamics that we have, for example, in Europe with an aging population. So that will also determine very much what we end up seeing as an end result at that time. Now, in theory, and the ideal modern city should be very condensed, which goes a little bit back to your point, which is a city where you're utilizing very little spaces, very, very vertical, not horizontal, because you obviously, it's much easier to travel from A to B, and you're utilizing many resources, water and space and everything in a much more efficient way. However, we know that that is not how we human beings behave and are growing. In fact, we tend to grow horizontally. There are many restrictions, even in London, as to how high, how tall you can build, and I don't foresee that changing very quickly at all. And also, the same statistics that talk about the growing population, United Nations statistics, also point to an increase in slum population from 1 billion currently to 3 billion people living in slums. And slums are not modern high races with, eye recognition and you name it. So that again is a very horizontal way. So unless there are very radical measures and governments start thinking of how they're planning all this inflow of persons, I don't think that's going to happen that quickly, but there will be measures in place. Unless that doesn't start to happen, we are going to be living in these, we're going to continue living in a relatively similar model as we are right now, and finding solutions to adapt, and then having some very modern cities like Neom Line, if that ever happens completely, that will be examples of where we could get. But for the time being, we need to be realistic. In 3 decades, what we can improve is the way these cities operate, and try to, as much as possible, incentivize consumer habits to change, to adapt more to the reality.
What about the mobility? Because when we talk about the future of mobility, we discussed it before, and everybody thinks about flying cars. So what is it? What are we expecting in terms of the future of travel, mobility, how it's gonna grow?
I'll take, I just don't want to hoard the time, but I'll just take quickly that one. I think that in 30 years' time, it's very likely we're looking at 3 different types of mobility. We're looking at underground, probably is developing a lot towards freight and towards automated systems carrying goods from A to B. And that is a technology that is available and is becoming more and more prevalent in the places where you can apply that. Then we have on-the-ground transportation, and then we have air transportation. I think it is feasible to think that in 3 decades is a long time. It's a long time in terms of technology. We will start to see certain flying transportation, and that will increasingly become a reality. And in terms of ground transportation, we have seen how over the last decade, ground transportation has changed a lot with Lime scooters and things like that, bikes, and then cars, and then of course public transportation improving, and then linking onto the suburbs. Now, I think that I'm just going to go back to what we all learned in this room as little kids. Sharing is caring. We all learned that when we were little, when we were fighting for toys. I think when it comes to mobility, we need to have, and I think this is actually shifting, more and more the willingness to share means of transportation. And that is actually happening. We want to electrify cars, but there's not enough battery materials to do so. So instead of having cars sitting idly for 95% of the time, which is what a private car does in the street, we need to find ways and schemes of sharing those vehicles. And in fact, that is happening at quite an accelerated pace. So we will see much more shared mobility and much more point-to-point streamline mobility. You maybe do your first mile in a scooter, and then from there you hop onto another means of transportation, and it's all seamlessly done thanks to the connectivity that is happening right now. All these vehicles are becoming computers on wheels, and that is just growing exponentially and exponentially. So I think you'll go out, you can program your whole trip, everything is seamless, you just get and do it, and it's all shared, and you don't necessarily need to own it. So I think that is becoming autonomous, will happen, but mainly right now from point A to B, that is where the big bulk of money is going.
You mentioned the NEOM, the line project. I know Hannah is working on it. So the future of cities are already being created. There are some examples in the past. Now there are new ones, great investments. So what do we expect from these cities? Are they really being smarter, more efficient? Can they bring a kind of a holistic approach to urban living? And maybe the second question around it would be the sense of place. Can we create it from scratch within these new cities?
Yeah, so I'll touch on kind of the NEOM Line project. For those that don't know, it's kind of a single building. It's going to be 170 kilometres long and 500 metres high. And it's, due to be exactly what Isabel said, very compact, enable that kind of 15-minute living, and by being very condensed, make it life far more kind of sustainable and efficient. I think there is logic in it from an infrastructure point of view. You think of building that high, infrastructure delivery is often constrained by roads and being able to access properties. In NEOM Line, you're essentially going to have 10 roads, so 10 infrastructure delivery levels, which will allow you to more efficiently kind of service the people that live in these modules. So I think from a sustainability and efficiency point of view, I can see the benefits there. It gives rise to significant other challenges. I think I read something that if you live at the top of the line and you go outside into your park, you only need to be outside for 10 minutes to get your recommended amount of vitamin D a day. If you're downstairs, right at the bottom, you have to be outside for 3 hours, 50 minutes per day, which is challenging. There's all kinds of things about how do you do fire safety and these type of things, how do emergency services work, all of those kind of challenges there. So I think it's an interesting experiment at the moment. I'll just touch on the sense of place point. I think that is one of the main challenges I see there. How do you create a sense of place from nothing, particularly in a place which is going to be so curated? It's going to be exactly as Rolf said, it's going to be the building knows what you want to do, it arranges everything, it leaves very little room for spontaneity, for kind of bottom-up making and agency, and I think they're key components of place. But I think you can create place from nothing. My family are from one of the new towns in the UK that was built after the war. There was nothing there before. It's now got a fantastic sense of community. But to do that, I think you need to get a stable population that's willing to stay for a while. And I think that goes back to why we live in cities. What are they going to put there? The cultural activities, the social activities that really make people want to stay and be able to build that community.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's incredible. I mean, I think we used to build things like that, right? You go back and look at the pyramids, look at the city, look at London, look at these incredible things that humans have built, and I think we need to continue to do that because it unlocks the imagination, and there's all kinds of technical challenges. It's kind of like when the U.S. went to the moon. The point was not to get someone on the moon. The point was that there were technologies blocking us from being able to get to the moon. And so we needed to solve those technology problems to get to the moon. And all of us, the cell phones in your pockets, almost any technology you touch today comes back from the space race. And so I think we need to be doing a lot of that. And I think a lot of it is progress. I mean, I know that, I don't discount the numbers in terms of slums, but by any metric, if you look at the world today, particularly the developing world, we are a heck of a lot better off than we were 50 years ago. I mean, if you talk about child mortality, if you talk about middle income, if you look at medicine, any of those things, it's massive progress. And I think cities enable that because cities are the ultimate place where you have density plus education plus resources for everybody, ideally. And so what that means is that the social mobility should be there because you're with everyone, you've got access to everything, right? Just like the phone, right? I mean, no one really has any excuse today not to be educated, right? You have a phone in your pocket that has unlimited resources to it, unlimited education. Every MIT class is on YouTube, okay? So you really have no excuse in terms of not getting yourself ahead. Now, I understand people have excuses and things like that, and maybe they spend all their time on Instagram instead, but that's their fault, right? And so to me, I think I'm very, very positive about the progress. And I think projects like this, there's obviously naysayers, there's people who don't do it, but I think it's great for humanity to be pushing the envelope and doing that. So that's my opinion.
I just want to, question. NEOM is it's not the first one, probably not going to be the last one.
Sure.
There are so many projects that are actually trying to push the human capabilities. There's one company in Netherlands that trying to actually create net zero villages. That's what the company does. Obviously, it's a matter of scale, but there is this newsletter called Startup Cities. It started as a newsletter and became a kind of like a movement. I urge you to join the conversation. The founder started it almost like 10, maybe 15 years ago. So he actually, guy, Zach, a computer engineer. So most of and he writes a lot, and obviously most of the followers, including myself, contribute. So most of the analogies he did, has been doing, he creates a link between the startup world and the cities. So he basically says that the cities has to be, starts or created by entrepreneurs and by startups. There's also kind of a link between, like Singapore and Dubai, where I spend a lot of time, is also called that, it's a city that is run by, not run like a startup, state, city, organizations that, makes things quite smooth. Of course, yes, it's, top to bottom. Same thing on most of the, including NEOM projects. Whereas I believe the, sustainable new cities, whether it's smart or smart is like a given thing, should be bottom up. And then Balaji, this famous thinker, he came up with this, a book called Network State. He also, takes this philosophy a step, further. He also thinks, that just like we have this cloud, we can create, anyone can create a company on cloud. So same thing we're going to see in the next 10 to 15 or 20 years happening on the city level. So first people come together on cloud, create the community, obviously backed by cryptocurrency, and then find a physical place in any place. And I'm thinking that there are existing countries willing to dedicate or even, inviting these communities that we've seen now in, through DAOs and stuff, decentralized, because I believe capital and intellect are going to be decentralized. I totally believe that obviously the 70% of the people in the future will live in the cities, live in probably in metropolitans. But again, I also think that just like you mentioned, Africa, only Nigeria is expecting to be 1 billion. So just like we've seen in China, created 120 cities above 50 million people living in. Same thing we're probably going to see in the sub-Saharan Africa. So that's also another challenge, and I really want to see how this is going to be, turn out to be.
Well, maybe what about the existing cities? Because these are the new creations. We'll see the outcome. But now all the cities, especially the metropolitan cities, tackling with all these challenges, they are transforming into smarter cities. And when you look at the technology now, how can the smart technologies can transform the cities we live in today and help them solve some of the major issues we're challenging? I think it's never been more urgent to create smarter or efficient or sustainable cities, considering the climate challenges we're facing, the urgency of a lot of societal matters as well. So how do you see the smart technologies help cities resolve these issues?
Okay. Maybe I'll pick on two examples that I'm currently working on. So the first one is, I think I mentioned it in Glasgow. Their NHS boards, I think across the UK, to be honest, they have something like 3,000 hours of care each week that they have no one to deliver. They have waiting lists for their nursing homes that they have no spaces in. So we're helping them implement technology-enabled care within the home to hopefully reduce the number of hours certain people need from carers and spread that more thinly. Whether that's a good thing, I think, is up for debate, but it is an example of technology helping. It's, I think one thing I've noticed is, as I start to deploy technology in cities, is there are benefits. We also have to be very conscious of the disbenefits as well. So in that case, those people that maybe don't have a carer now come in every day, that carer was probably the only person they saw that day. And loneliness and social isolation, I think, is something as bad as smoking 20 or 30 cigarettes a day. So you're shifting a problem maybe somewhere else in the health service. But I think the ageing population and technology is an area where we can make a significant difference. Another area relating to what you said, Mette, was in Birmingham, we're doing a sustainable neighbourhood. There's lots of physical interventions there, and we're kind of doing a digital overlay on that as well. So sensors in home, vehicle to grid, those type of technologies. And the challenge I see there is the technology works, and I think in a lot of these cases the technology works. What doesn't work is either the governance structure of the place or the commercial model behind it. So there, this technology is delivering a really wide range of benefits. It's reducing energy bills for the residents, it's reducing load on the grid and the need to expand energy infrastructure for the energy company. It's we're going to do predictive maintenance for the council that reduce their bills. The health service is going to use it to identify fuel poverty earlier and intervene. Who pays for what? What's the model there? How do we get them all to commit and work together? I think that's symptomatic of a lot of European smart city projects. They tend to be funded by public sector funds on a very time-limited basis. They prove the technology, it works wonderful. The commercial model and the kind of integration with governance is forgotten. I think that's maybe where we need to really focus some effort, and then we can see scale.
I mean, I think there's a lot also of commercially. It's always going to be a balance between non-commercially viable solutions, but that need to be there and have to be funded in some way or shape, and commercially viable ones. I'm just thinking of an example of one of the investments we have in our fund. It's a company called No Traffic. It's an Israeli company, but is deploying in the US. And what they do actually is they manage traffic lights based on traffic flow rather than based on the classic time. So you're sitting there rolling your thumbs thinking, why am I sitting in this red light if there's no single car? And of course, the technology advancement over the last decade in terms of supercomputers and the power of machines to basically do a number of calculations and predictions has enabled these types of technologies to flourish. So that's, for example, one example, and that is actually highly monetizable. And it also allows for another very interesting, or two interesting things, is not only managing traffic better and therefore reducing congestion maybe by 30 to 40% in cities, but it's also the fact that because they sit in every single intersection of a city, they are able actually to understand what has happened, for example, in the case of an accident, and as opposed to an insurance company spending a week trying to investigate an accident. I mean, the US is 200 accidents per intersection, major intersection, every single year. They are already sitting on the data. They also allow a municipality, for example, if they want to establish carpooling corridors in order to, again, incentivize sharing and stuff like that, to do that in a very efficient way. 30 years on the line, what you were asking about before, flying technology, it will be very efficient once it starts and rolls out, because of course you're not going zigzagging through buildings, you're actually going from A to B in a much more efficient way. So there are things from a technological point of view which will help a lot. Now, one thing, of course, is two things: cybersecurity attached to this. Well, funding, as we said, cybersecurity, and of course, data. A lot of this is based on a huge amount of data of how we behave and how we want to live. And maybe I don't want anybody to know that much about my life. So that's also a very big question that is worth touching upon, and that can be can hold back certain ideal technologies, because as human beings, we actually maybe don't want to be monitored that much. So it's that fine balance. I don't know if...
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of a city like London or a big city, Lagos, et cetera, I think there's a few things, right? So, I mean, one is just resilience and the climate. And so as we build new buildings in these cities, we're looking at more sustainable materials. So one example is concrete. So concrete is about 8% of all CO2 in the world. If concrete was a country, the country of concrete, very boring country, it would be the third largest emitter of carbon behind China and the US. And so there's all kinds of incredible innovators now trying to get clean concrete. And we invested in one at Fifth Wall out of our sustainability fund. So one is just as we build cleaner materials, I think we'll be retrofitting a lot of buildings to make them more sustainable. That includes a lot of things like, stuff we have, like insulation, ceiling, and then heat pumps, which are much more efficient. I also think we'll be greening the grid, which we're already doing. So a lot of renewables as part of that. Obviously, we can't have that all right now, but at some point we'll do that. And then I think we'll really look at resilience for cities. So London's in a decent spot because the Thames is fairly controlled in terms of water level. But if you think about a Miami or even a Lagos on the water, you're going to be building a lot of protection around that city. In a sense, all cities will be like Amsterdam, right, as sea level rises, and so part of that. So I think that those will be some of the technology, but there's very specific applications that are part of it. Another one that's interesting is just to be more energy efficient with buildings. There's new window companies that have automatic shading on the window so that it reflects light or takes out the light so that the building doesn't need to be cooled as much. So it's all in the built world, because about 40% of CO2 is the built world, it's real estate. And so we know we need to target that and make it part of it as part of that. And then my hope also is much cheaper construction. So with the rising cost of construction costs in the country, both on materials and mostly labor, modular construction has become a huge thing. And there's a few really big modular construction companies here in the UK that are doing an incredible job. And basically that just means building a house in a factory as opposed to building it on site. And so there's an incredible amount of technology going into that that's super exciting.
So I think maybe it's shifting away from more consumer-facing technologies towards the ones that are addressing more urban challenges. like the ones you just mentioned, will make a big difference. But what about taking this forward? You also mentioned the commercial side of it. Is technology ready, available, but also the business models, are they ready to take the smart cities to the next level where we can actually resolve some of the major issues?
I think technology is here today, and obviously I'm coming from uh, pro technology, so I believe we're going to have a lot of new technologies. A lot of smart people trying to develop a lot of cool technologies. Again, just like you said, A, cybersecurity, B, privacy. We've seen this thing happen in Toronto with Sidewalk Labs. The guy, Google came up with a plan, but had to back off. Even though they say it's due to the pandemic, but again, a lot of backlash from the city, how exactly the data to be collected is going to be used, stored, etc. So they say it's not the smart city; it's going to be the city that is smart. So I like the explanation. Anyway, so the technology obviously is just a tool to transform. I believe we need to focus more on transforming the existing cities rather than building up from scratch in the middle. Even though we need to focus on the city level, we still need to start small, just like startup. Again, that analogy helps us a lot. You first do the MVP and then you scale. So you first need to, by the way, there are companies in US, in Europe, in Asia as well. But Asian ones are quite different because again, it's from top to bottom. So there's no obviously concern about using the data, storing the data. So if you want to do that in Europe or in, let's say, in West, so a lot of questions now coming up, because if you look at China, I mean, there are absolutely amazing technologies, all connected. But again, do you actually want to share your data? For that reason, I believe one of the cool technologies, just like Rolf mentioned, along with modular, etc. I think self-identity self-sovereign identity is going to be super important, because you don't know at the end, eventually, what we do and practice today, whatever we do online, is going to be mirrored in the physical world. So would you share your data while you're getting your coffee, or getting into the parking lot with the parking app? So you actually need to control your data, who to give to, who to share to. I think rather than looking into the all prop tech technologies, I think cybersecurity and privacy will be as important as the other ones.
Yeah, I mean, the technology is there. It's just we just need to get out of our own way. I mean, I just think I don't really think about things being sometimes good or bad. I just think about what is, and I just know that data is going to be shared. I mean, people complain about data privacy in Europe, and then they willingly give Facebook and Instagram all the data for free, right? So we need, as particularly in Europe, we need to get out of our own way. I mean, the NHS, and we get a lot of, I mean, people need to be positive. The NHS is probably one of the most advanced medical systems in the world, and one of the reasons is the data sharing. They do a ton of data analysis on the NHS, and that saves tons of lives. So yes, do there need to be some privacy and protections? But I just think at the end of the day, we're going to share data. Data is going to get shared, and we need to get out of our own way in that particular thing. I think it's the same thing with cities, right? Cities have a real tough time building. We've had a housing shortage in London for 20 years. It's not solved. Everyone knows it's an issue. Why is it an issue? Because city councilors can't get out of their own way. It's impossible to build in the city. So we need to get more streamlined structures to obviously protect people, but at the same time, you've got to realize that this is just going to happen, right? Because Europe is not leading in anything right now in terms of technology, and one of the reasons is that it's so obsessed with protection and privacy that it wants to be kind of the tech regulator, right? And that's not something to innovate on. So to me, I think you've got to have a change of framework, a change of philosophy, and to move things forward, because otherwise we're just going to keep getting in our own way, in my opinion.
I do think, especially in a European context, it seems to matter who is collecting the data or who is using it. If you look just around the corner, the new King's Cross development, people went mad when they found out that Google were collecting all kinds of data there. But every day when you use the tube, TfL track you all around the tube network.
That's right.
But people seem happier with that because it's maybe a public sector organisation. They know what they're using it for. So I think you're right. And I think maybe we just need to think about how you position it, how you tell people the value they get from data, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely like negative things on social media. I mean, I think our minds have not evolved enough to handle social media, particularly children. And I think, we probably need to ban it for anyone under 18, in my opinion, because it's a dangerous weapon. But I think that in terms of like, I'm just kind of very surprised at the selective outrage, right, in terms of people's lives and what they decide to be outraged by. And I totally understand in terms of Google and big companies collecting it, but it's there and it's going to happen, and it is making your life seemingly better. So.
Okay, but I also think I agree that our life improves when we can look at collective data and analyze it. But it's also important as individuals that we, for example, know that certain safeguards are in place in order to first. I don't have a problem sharing my data if it's anonymously shared. So, for example, that is important. And whilst it is true that Europe might be a bit policing the whole system, it's also good that they have actually policed the system, because that has also brought in a lot of data protection, especially, for example, for kids, that then has been adopted by the US and by other countries. So they've been at the forefront of saying, okay, all this is very nice, but suddenly, where do we draw a line? So I think that the debate needs to be there, because as human beings, as individuals, we kind of want to, I think we want to have a bit of control on our own privacy. So that's one aspect of it. And I also think that, so going back to the theme of cities, because we can diverge into data and cybersecurity and all that. And of course, it's a very important aspect. I'm personally quite positive that there are many good things that are coming out in terms of technology and that are growing exponentially. Technologies that still don't exist, or that exist and will be opened up, and technologies that exist and are growing a lot. So, for example, 30 years ago, if we think 30 years ago, about 30 years ago is when Bill Clinton actually opened up GPS. That was a complete transformation. Right now we are talking about supercomputers, and there was a lot of talk in the last decade about quantum computing. That still is not a reality, to be honest, but there might be a government that is already kind of close to there. Will they open it to the general public, or just sit on that technology for a while before they open it, but whatever. But what we are is progressing in that sense. In terms of fuels, before I was mentioning how vehicle sharing from scooters all the way up to cars and everything is very important, because we have a limited supply of materials, raw earth materials and others, in order to fuel all these batteries and therefore cover the demand for this kind of cleaner vehicles. But there are other clean solutions that are being rolled out, like hydrogen for bigger transportation, bigger mobility things. So, for example, carbon capture, which I'm actually quite excited about, because in 30 years' time, I think we will see some pretty amazing fuels produced out of the carbon we are managing to actually capture in the city. So we are decarbonizing or utilizing that again. So for recycling. So there are a host of incredibly interesting technologies, all the building ones that you have mentioned, all the solutions that you in turn have mentioned, in order to make our lives better. So I have a very positive outlook, but I think that as collectively as human beings, we have to be prepared to change consumer habits, and we have to have governments incentivizing that with a whole number of policies that kind of steer people in that into that direction, because otherwise we can be very stubborn as human beings in changing our habits. Have to have incentives, and that has to be very well thought of.
Real estate is also known as traditionally quite stubborn, and it actually welcomed change later than most of the other sectors, maybe because it didn't need to, but now with the whole regulations changing, maybe good or bad from the EU as well, the push for the net zero carbon targets. So we hope the technology is available and the future ones will help create resilient cities.
Yes, of course. Just to add a footnote to that, auto sector in Germany is 15% of GDP. Okay, it employs hundreds of thousands of people. When you're suddenly going from a normal car to an electric vehicle, you're going from 6,000 pieces to 2,000 components in that same vehicle, in that same kind of motor/engine. And you're completely transforming the way you design it. There's a huge resistance to implementing that technology that quickly, because there's a whole social issue. How do you employ? How do you transform? What do you do with all these people? And what is the social backlash that has, and the political backlash in every single one of these places? So with same thing, we know this, with fossil fuels, again, how quickly that employs. There's been a big resistance until it's just hit us on our face, and then we're all like, okay, well, we need to do something about it. So with all these things, it's also this permanent give and take that we are facing in order to make progress with the technologies to implement them, because a lot of the technologies are out there. Electric cabs existed 100 years ago in London. So,
One thing I like to add is that I believe data sharing will be super important. Obviously, we know that more, the cars are going to be, smart, electrified, etc. So they create enormous amount of data. How many energy they use, where they stop, where they park, etc. So imagine all these automotive, obviously they are brands, own huge amount of market share. So they, if you take Toyota, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, so they all come together and now creating a marketplace through blockchain, so that there has to be again anonymity and privacy. So I believe real estate, specifically buildings and cities, obviously, will be 10 times, maybe 100 times more. Imagine all the data we are already collecting, starting from the commercial buildings. The temperature, humidity, air quality, the movement, etc. So a lot of, once you realize, and if you look at from the neighborhood, county or city level, there will be so many companies who are trying to obviously get all this data. When you have the data, obviously, when you want to build something else, somewhere else, obviously you now start from not 0, but from, 10. So I think that creates exponential, movement as well.
I think we do have to be careful on the data point. I think you mentioned the inability to build homes in London. I think, more widely, a lot of local authorities their planning systems are procured from companies that have not upgraded their systems in years, and actually they have to pay a fee every time they want to retrieve data from that system. And I think there's a risk, if we don't structure contracts right and get the governance right, private sector companies will be collecting all this data, and actually the city, Uber probably knows more about London's transport network than TfL does at the moment. There's no rule in place at the moment that they share really high level data. They share a journey time, but don't tell you how many cars made that journey time. It could be 1, it could be 100. How do we make sure that we're linking all this data together somehow, getting them in similar formats or similar structures, putting the sharing agreements in place at the contract signature stage to allow all this value to be delivered? Otherwise, we end up with loads of different point solutions. Cities may be at the behest of private companies saying we don't fancy upgrading, we don't want to share data here, there, or everywhere. I think if we could get that layer in place now, it maximizes the potential.
Coming soon.
Well, I think in real estate we deal with a fundamental problem when it comes to housing, which is everyone wants more homes in their neighborhood until you own a home, right? And so this is the fundamental issue with real estate, why we will always have shortages in housing, is that everyone wants more homes except when you own a home, because when you own a home, if there's a new home near you, it lowers the pricing technically in your head of the homes around you. Now that works until you don't have any housing, and then your community deteriorates. So we have to figure out incentive systems by which we basically incentivize owners in a municipality to build as part of that. And so one thing London did, which was interesting, was that they had planning consent where if you weren't in a historic area, you could add 2 levels to your flat or your building if you weren't above, I think it was like 20 stories. And so what that did is a bunch of developers went to the owners of the building and said, look, we'll add 2 and then we'll split 50-50 the profit with you. And so it ended up actually adding a lot of housing, not a huge amount because London has a lot of historic areas, but I think you have to think about that, of how do we incentivize people to do something in the short term uneconomic to them, but in the long term very economic because they get vibrant cities and vibrant neighborhoods. And then also the issue in London also, and it's very local, but a lot of you are probably going to work in London, is that the councils have a lot of control on the building. And so because it's local councils controlling a lot of what gets built and the approvals, you end up with this kind of hashtag of rules as opposed to the government kind of being able to just set it out. And I think if the housing crisis gets bad enough, that the government will just say, that's it, we have to start building.
So, conscious of time, although we started a bit late, but maybe I'll open the floor for questions so we can discuss more.
Thank you for speaking to all the panelists. I'm Ivan Compass, from a recent graduate from UCL, not in LSE. I'd like to ask about sustainability and climate resilience, because I think I came a bit late to this event. Climate change and the impacts of them are very devastating to cities. And how city planners and governments have to work, and what do governments and city planners still have to work on in terms of building a climate resilient cities? Because, and if I'd like to give an example about cities of tomorrow, I'm from Indonesia, and it was recently announced that the capital is being moved. But then I'd like to say that that decision is actually a double-edged sword, because if you don't move the capital, you're going to have to end days of government productivity being cut by natural disasters such as flooding. But then if you move the capital to Borneo, you're going to end up cutting down the number of forests and orangutans. That's one example of dilemmatic city planning for the future.
It's very much your field, that one, but because you deal a lot with the public, private.
Yeah,
initiatives.
I'm just trying to think. There's so many different geographies. How to answer that from multiple perspectives. So, planning.
Well, so, I mean, cities are doing this, right? So New York City is building a flood wall with Big, which is one of my favorite architects. you know, London is okay situated, but you could get more used to extreme weather events, right? So more heat in the summer, maybe colder winters. So there's all kinds of interesting. So cities are actually doing this. I'm very positive about cities. And cities in the U.S., although the national government's kind of behind, at a city level, it's in some cases more progressive than Europe. So there's a few ways they're doing it. One is that simple things that are out there in material sciences, such as painting streets certain colors so that there's not as much reflective heat on buildings and reflective heat on, it's like a very simple solution. Planting trees actually is a huge heat saver from a city because you get a lot of shading and therefore less air conditioning. And then what they're also doing is creating incentive systems. So New York has a, I forgot the name, but proposition, it's a law that they're passing where each building and each landlord is basically going to get an allocation of carbon, and then they can't go over that or they get fined, right? The city of London just was named, I actually think, the cleanest or the most sustainable big city out there. So the city, and remember, when I talk about the city, I mean the city, like, you know, the city of London, not the surrounding area, but the city of London's one of the cleanest. So, you know, each country's going to need to do its own things. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's not like we're too late, but there will be some rising, and I think places like Miami, certainly Indonesia, other areas are going to have to figure out how to get resilient very quickly. But I do think the engineering will be there to be able to do that. So
It has to be a fair balance between adaptation and mitigation.
right.
Because some solutions are easily implementable, like some of the ones that you've mentioned, and are no-brainers, and there shouldn't be a reason why we're not doing them. And some of them are a little bit more complicated and can't be done immediately, and therefore at that point you have to talk about adapting to that new reality whilst you finally find a way of totally mitigating that whatever is going on. I don't know the specific case of Indonesia, but it's
Yeah, I mean, like Jakarta is facing a lot of climate-related disasters. Flooding is frequent, sea levels rising, but then the government had already committed to moving the capital soon. However, moving the capital also carries out environmental trade-offs by cutting down more forests and orangutan population, which have been under threat by historic palm oil plantations in Borneo. That's one example.
Yeah, I think the reason I struggle to answer this much is so much of the investments for kind of adaptation, I feel there's always a strong social equity question around it. They tend to protect the high value areas maybe, and how do we make sure that finance is distributed effectively to protect lots of people. You can imagine in Jakarta the rich could probably move somewhere where the flooding isn't going to occur. What happens to the people that are still there? So I think that infrastructure interventions are well and good, but I think there needs to be a really strong policy layer of how you ensure equity in those situations.
Yeah, I think you should hold your leaders accountable, right? Like Germany, I mean, I can't believe that all of those people have not been thrown out of government, considering like the natural gas policy, right? So people need to hold their politicians accountable because, and they're going to start doing that in sustainability, and they're going to start asking questions. And so, again, I'm not an expert on Indonesia, you are, but I think that's the important thing is we need to hold our politicians accountable for good decisions, good policies to do that. So
there's also, I guess, the question of countries like the Maldives, who are going to be virtually uninhabitable, but they were not major contributors to it. So there's also there's what you do, but how it's funded, and they're probably going to have to, unfortunately, move a whole load of their communities and cities. But how do they pay for that, and who pays for that based on what's happened?
That's the main criteria. Money.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting.
Could you press the button?
oh, you got to press. It's like the UN. You got to.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting. You talked about electric vehicles on one hand and shared transportation on the other hand. So would you say it's fair to say that in 2050 car ownership will be very different than what it is today?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Or hope so, maybe.
And we hope so. For a lot of people, especially in developing countries, owning that big first car is is a big deal, whilst other people that are in a different reality and are fortunate enough maybe to be in the other side of the scale is like, I'm super happy to share. It's not such a big deal. So there's a normal kind of S curve that happens with that, and precisely to that's why I was talking about incentives before. Models, for example, as I say, sharing cars or subscription models and other things that have to be put in place in these more emerging maybe economies and realities in order to enable that huge population as well to feel, okay, this is a very nice alternative as well, and I don't have to put upfront all this money to have access to a vehicle, and therefore actually sharing. And because there's such big improvements in connectivity in the vehicles themselves, and we haven't touched upon it because we don't have time to touch upon everything, but there's also everything that has to do with smart highways and smart roads, where everything becomes connected, and where you don't only know where the vehicle is, but you also know when it needs to be maintained and when it needs to be, there's all the predictive maintenance and all that stuff going on. All these are also incentives for people to maybe not necessarily own a car, because you get all the problems out of your head and you just use it when you need it. It's a much more efficient solution. So hopefully, yes, hopefully we have less. And then of course there's legislation on the other side of closing up city centers and making them more pedestrianized. So it's a combination of many things. It's from the legislation, what are the do's and the do nots? What is the technology allowing you to do? What's the economic value there? How can I incentivize consumers to be super happy with that solution? And how can I make it really work? Because not only convince you to go into a subscription model, a sharing model, it's also that I really deliver and it really works for everybody. So how can we also get that? And also, of course, how do we have very good better public transportation systems in place? And as I say, a lot of the technology is out there. So, for example, another very big reason to own a car is so. Before you would do the last mile in your car, you would arrive to the door. Nowadays, you maybe pick a scooter or you pick a bike, so that is already happening. But you also would own a car because you have to travel a long distance, okay? And for example, those Hyperloop trains, I don't know if you've seen any of those. They're like in a tunnel, and they go at 800 kilometers per hour, and it's like super fast. I mean, it's very interesting. Google it because it's super interesting. And that connects cities very, very fast. And that's actually a technology that is, Elon Musk calls it the fifth transportation means. And that will allow as well people to say, well, I don't really need to travel that distance. I hop on the train in half an hour, wherever it is. So it's a combination of many factors.
There's also like a social component, right, that has changed, which is a car used to be it still is a social status, right? You just have to go to Knightsbridge on a Saturday and you can see that, right? But I think less and less so, right? Where like if your date picks you up and they're walking you to the restaurant, it's not as big a deal as it used to be. You show up with your nice car, right? And so I think that's changed, and that's what's going to be interesting, is that there is always a social component to this, because car was a reflection of status, right, and economics. And so now instead it seems to be having an iWatch or something, right? So I mean, I think these things will socially change, which is always interesting to look at. But yeah, I mean, I think the ownership will change for sure.
I think we're going to see a similar transition, which you've already been seeing it. Like the music industry, the young generation. I have a son. Obviously, I used to go to Virgin on started with cassettes and then CDs. I'm old. But obviously, all his new generation, they never even thought about it. So they just go Spotify, and then use the service or whenever you need to. So same thing. So you have a budget and you dedicate some portion to GSM. At the end of the day, it allows you to communicate A to B. Same thing for mobility. The moment we think about that, we need to go from A to B, that is actually a whole shift than thinking only like the automotive or car. So I agree.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you.
Yes, let's start from the back.
Start back.
Come towards the front.
It's not the same.
Thank you. So thank you so much for this discussion. One thing that I think we've sort of addressed, but the role of policymaking, especially here for those of you that are investors, what are your interactions with policymakers at a city level? Whether it is regarding the companies you're investing in and what they're proposing for cities, and whether it's what kind of in a game theory aspect game you're playing with policymakers, if there's any interaction at all in the first place, whether they can leverage that, create incentives for you and for the companies and so on.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a lot of interaction with policy officials. There's no real games. It's just, look, but I'm very lucky because VC is seen as very exciting and seen a lot of the future of London and the future of the UK and tech is. And so I actually think the government here, I mean, I kind of criticize the policy, but I think government and government officials and policy, like, they definitely want to help, right? And if you go to them with a very specific thing of, hey, this is blocking me, they will go and try to solve it because of jobs and et cetera, right? And so I think that's great. And there's a number of working groups I've been asked to be part of. People are very focused on technology here, which is phenomenal for the city and for the UK. So there's a lot of interaction on that. But I think the big issue is always, are they focusing on it? Can they get it through? And then, is it going to have a big impact? And I would say the one where I've had most frustration probably is just in the university spinouts. So the model in the UK for university spinouts are very punitive to founders, and it actually hurts a lot of the ecosystem here in terms of the amount of equity the university gets is quite high versus the US and other places. And what it actually ends up doing is that a lot of students in a lab or professors in a lab, if they really find something, they'll kind of take a sabbatical for 6 months and then magically there's a company, right? And so I think that they need to do a better job of that, and we've talked to them about that, and they're trying to push that. The second is that the pension infrastructure and the investment infrastructure in the UK and Europe is very low on venture capital and very low on tech, and they continue to be. Now, some of that is structural because you've got an aging population, you have big defined benefits, but I do think that they're missing the Googles of Europe. I mean, the truth is a lot of the investors are going to come from the Middle East and the US, and they're going to find the Googles of Europe and invest in them, and then the local citizens and their investment plans are going to miss being equity holders in that. So I do think that that's another area where they really need to start pushing the pensions to do more in technology. So.
Maybe I can contribute from Middle East. Dubai is really, future oriented, and they welcome whether it's the consultants. They love to, and they know how to work with consultants. So what they did in the past 20 years, I believe, push the other countries in the Gulf region, in the GCC, plus the when you look at the whole MENA, the big market is Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So even though you set up a company in UAE, Dubai, or anywhere else, they actually want to go to the Saudi market or Egypt because that's where the population is. But now Riyadh is doing what Dubai has been doing, So now, the end of this month, we're going to have a PropTech conference in Bahrain. And the reason is that they actually want to do something as well. And I was talking to the content team, and they literally, usually what happens is that, especially in that part of the world, they actually go out and make their own, kind of show. But they say that we actually want to hear others, what others did, so that because they're trying to come up with their own prop tech strategy. So that's interesting. So a lot of, they're very open to work with consultants or startups, especially in startups, because they know that the oil economy is ending. So they're, quite aggressive on transforming their economy.
Yes, gentlemen, just at the back. Futurist, if I recall correctly from the previous panel.
There you go. We've had a really interesting discussion. Thank you. I guess we've been doing quite a lot of normative stuff based on trends we can see now and technologies we can see now. But if you look at what's already going on in local authorities in London and around the country, in the last 3 months, we've seen a massive cancellation of technology projects and infrastructure projects because of their concerns over infrastructure costs, technology costs, declining expenditure from government that they're expecting, environmental challenges. So, and you're starting to see a lot of talk about degrowth and moving people out of the cities. Is it worth thinking about alternative scenarios then than the sort of normative one we've been discussing, and starting to think about very different models of how we might organise over the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I was having some discussions up around Sellafield in Cumbria last week, and obviously Sellafield is the big nuclear hub, and it's being decommissioned, and it currently employs 10,000 people. Copeland Council, I think it accounts for about 80% of their employment, and the surrounding ones, and we were thinking about what is this economy going to be in the future, and your point around moving people out of cities, it's beautiful up there, it's in the Lake District. What about, these decentralization of population? What if you can work wherever you want, live wherever you want, have that lifestyle, if you want a country lifestyle, but have the income and the connections into the city? So we're starting to think there about how do they put themselves forward as a kind of a wellness lifestyle, low house prices type of place, but with digital connectivity that allows it to connect into kind of economic centres wherever they may be. They might be in the UK, they might be elsewhere. So I think it's certainly a fair point around needing to be more agile, think differently, think about new models of economy, and how that might arrange itself.
I mean, that could go back to the question we had about Indonesia, capital cities, are they that necessarily? Yes, yeah, but the model of spreading out different government departments into different cities in order to promote, put in a ministry of here and another ministry there and another ministry there, and giving more fair opportunities to those cities. There's a very big argument to do that, and I think that over the pandemic, where of course working from home consolidated much more, but there was also a sense of, well, actually, I can kind of live 3 hours away from London, and I was hoping personally, this is on a personal level, I was thinking, you have so many very beautiful places out there that have been virtually abandoned. How nice would it be if you start creating new urban centers out of that? So I think it's also an option that is still on the table. You do need to create anchors, economic anchors, and that has been also always an ongoing discussion. I think that up to now there was a bit of the feeling that the sense of urgency that you need to go back to the capital city or to the main city because you still need to meet face to face. Fortunately, that has been, I think, changing with the work from home, and we've been accepting that maybe I don't need to see you every single day, and we can still work quite well. Technology is clearly supporting that. Will it be 100% shift? I don't think necessarily so, because what we were saying before, cities are also a combination of other things, it's play, lifestyle and all that. It's very difficult to replicate many Londons throughout the UK, but hopefully you can do quite a lot to make very nice places elsewhere and facilitate people's lives so that we have more urban centres that are efficient and are at a human measure as well. Yeah.
And also maybe, I think I came to the end of the talk before, and they were talking about how recession can actually be maybe a good time to be a graduate, because I think someone said that they're quite low cost, but also businesses are looking to do things differently. And I think when I speak to the NHS trusts I work with, their numbers are only going one way. The budgets are not going anywhere near that. The people needing care. So at some point, there's going to have to be a radical change in how we deliver some of these services. I was speaking with a water company last week, and we were showing them this leak detection solution we had, and he said, "I don't have time for this. I need to go find the leaks." And
welcome to big government.
Yeah, and so at some point, I think I am equally as horrified, and when I work with the local authorities, I see the pressure they're under. But I think at some point we can't keep struggling on. There's going to have to be a radical shift in how we try to deliver infrastructure services and the models around them.
I think there is one saying that the government is the worst vehicle humans created to spend money.
Yes, please.
I was interested earlier, you said that the technology is there in a lot of cases, but the governance models and the commercial business models are lagging behind. And I was curious if you have come across any promising or interesting example of governance or business model that could scale up in the future outside of the car sharing or e-mobility with the scooters.
Me specifically?
Any?
Well, a lot of technologies.
Well, I'll give you one, right? So, like, autonomous trains, right? Like, we've had autonomous trains forever. If you go to Paris and there's a strike, there's 2 trains that still work because they're autonomous. And yet, all the lines in the tube have a driver there as backup. We have touch stations for all the screens, but if you go into the tube stations, there's still ticket counters with people. And all of that is the union, basically, that doesn't want to give up those jobs. So, that's a classic example. If you've got automation that's there, but obviously you've got an interest group that's sitting there that is trying to protect its members, which is totally understandable. But at the same time, it's holding back technology, right? So I think that's kind of one very prescient example, and you're seeing it with the railroad strikes. But the truth is that technology just marches forward. And I think the reason that the government hasn't given in, and I think the reason that they're not going to, and it's changed, is the work from home. Because it's taken a huge impact out of these strikes, because people can just say, okay, I can just stay at home and work. And I think you're going to start seeing that. So,
I'd add, I think the technology-enabled care use cases are going to have to scale, one, out of necessity, and 2, the business model for them is just, it stacks up so favourably in the face of kind of resource pressures as well. An interesting one that I've been seeing more about recently, which I think has real potential, is kind of I guess heat as a service type thing. So instead of paying your energy bills based on amount you use, you say, I want my house always to be 22 degrees, and I want 2 electric vehicle charges per week or something, and you run it more like a phone contract, and that allows the energy company flexibility in their grid usage and things like that. And I thought that was quite interesting because it would significantly reduce the amount of extra infrastructure we'd need to build. People would still hopefully get what they need. You'd have a contractual price that you pay, no fluctuations. So I can see that working really well if the regulations are changed.
Kind of like a pre-agreement in advance.
Yeah.
If you look at the emerging markets, the example real game can be 10 times, 100 times. I've seen. Remember, I went to a meeting. The door works with a fingerprint. The guy using next to me is from the company, and he knocked the door. I said, "Why are you knocking the door?" He says, "The doorman is going to open the door, but you have the fingerprint. We don't use that. We just took it because we had the budget." I also remember that there's this recycled bins, plastic, all the usual stuff, metal and stuff. So you, as a person in the office, you drop each one, and then the truck comes in, and it all it goes all to the same truck. So you basically doing anything, and then another people are actually working because you need salaries or people with salaries. So they actually push, even though you end up investing money on technology, but you're not using it. So interesting stuff. That's also another dilemma about the knowledge. Obviously, with pandemic, people actually want to go out the city centers and live in green and stuff. But then, what percent of your economy will allow you to do that? Again, we're coming back to the Harari's useless society, and so that's another social thing.
Thank you. I think we ran out of time since Ken is getting up. I would like to thank you again for joining us. Maybe it's time for a round of applause for our speakers. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Didem. We're ready for you, and actually, round of applause for Didem as well for navigating quite a technical panel. So we've just passed 5, and upstairs on the first floor we've got a tech expo and a VR experience for you guys to experience. So if you'd like to make your way up there, the team's ready to receive you. And I realize for some of you, you've just come for one day. So if that's the case, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Please do reach out with any feedback, any positive inputs. We'd love to kind of hear from you what we could do better, what we could improve. But genuinely thank you all for being here and making this an amazing experience. And for those of you here tomorrow, we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much, guys. Have a lovely summer.